Before my granddaughter's wedding even took place, I had already dismantled it. Not with gossip, and not with some loud, dramatic scene. I did it with a single sentence that I was never supposed to say out loud. It happened while Leora was standing in front of the full-length mirror. A rare sliver of Seattle sunshine was cutting through the blinds, resting softly against her shoulders. Porch. That wedding dress looked like it had been made for her from the day she was born. She looked so peaceful, carrying that dangerous certainty young women have when they honestly believe. Love is enough to shield them from the rest of the world. I stood right behind her, smoothing down a seam that did not need smoothing. Porch. My hands were moving out of pure habit, but my chest felt tight, gripped by a warning I could not ignore. The room smelled like steam, fresh fabric, and floral arrangements delivered way too early. Everything was too pretty. Everything was too quiet. Right then, I knew keeping silent was the most dangerous thing I could do. Porch. My name is Marlo Green, and I raised my granddaughter completely on my own. No husband to lean on, no relatives taking shifts to help, no safety net. Just me, learning how to stay solid as a rock so she could grow up without learning fear before her time. When my gut sounds an alarm, I do not argue with it. I listen. Porch. I have buried enough mistakes in my lifetime to know that sometimes silence is the very thing that costs you everything. Leora caught my eye in the mirror. She gave me a gentle, trusting smile, and for a second it almost made me stop. Almost. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. It was a text from Delphine Carter, filled with heart emojis and a sweet reminder about the rehearsal lunch. Porch. From the day we met Delphine, she had been picture perfect. Pearls around her neck, a soft-spoken voice, and that polished charm people so easily mistake for genuine character. The women at church could not stop praising her. The wedding planner took her advice without her even having to ask twice. Porch. Strangers smiled just hearing her name, as if being on Delphine Carter's good side meant you belonged to high society. When she hugged Leora, it felt like ownership disguised as affection. The first time she shook my hand, she held on just a second too long, telling me how well I had raised Leora, and how lovely she was, using the exact tone someone uses when appraising an expensive antique. Porch. Her husband, Harold Carter, stood right behind her, nodding along as if agreeing with his wife was his only job in life. The groom, Julian, politely kissed Leora on the forehead and thanked me. His brother Evan barely even looked up from his phone. The entire family was smooth and calm. It was that exact calm that made a lump form in my throat. Porch. I kept placing pins, fighting to keep my voice steady while watching Leora hang on every text from that family, as if their approval was the very air she breathed. 2 days before a wedding, a bride will make excuses for almost anything just to protect her perfect day. I was not going to stand by and watch her walk into a trap with a smile on her face. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. Porch. I spoke in the calm, measured tone you use when warning someone that a car is getting way too close. Listen to me, I said quietly. Never ever tell Delphine about your trust fund. The air in the room shifted instantly. It was not loud or dramatic, but Leora froze, and I knew the words had hit home. Porch. Her smile stayed pinned to her reflection, but the edges began to crack, like glass under heavy pressure. Grandma, she started, and I could hear the pushback in her voice. Please, not right now. I leaned in closer, keeping my voice low so the fear would not drift through the room. Not your husband, not his mother, not a single person in that family. Not a whisper, not a hint. She swallowed hard. Porch. You keep it hidden, I told her. Just like you hid your first heartbreak so you could finish high school. You keep it hidden just like you hid your fears when I was sick so I would not worry. Anyone who has raised a child alone knows what it costs to speak the hard truth when the whole world expects you to be polite and grateful. Leora reached back and took my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. Porch. Delphine has been nothing but good to me, she said, choosing each word carefully as if being nice could erase my warning. She just likes things organized. Organized. That word hit me like an old nightmare I had never managed to forget. Organized meant signing legal papers. Organized meant total control. I kept my expression gentle, because when an elder panics, panic spreads fast. Birch. Good intentions can still be dangerous, I told her. Some people do not reach into your pockets with force. They trap you with rules, paperwork, and standard procedures. Leora searched my face in the mirror, looking for any sign that I was exaggerating. But why would I? Her phone buzzed again. Delphine's name lighting up the screen. Leora did not answer it. She just stared at it. Birch. I laid my hand over hers, feeling her pulse race. Her voice dropped to a whisper, terrified of being overheard. Grandma, why? Because I learned firsthand how deep a thin piece of paper can cut you. It happened years ago. There was no shouting, no threats, no slamming doors. Birch. It was just quiet conversation in a living room that smelled like casseroles and lilies, coming from a woman with a smile that was far too sweet. She slid a folder across the table toward me, as if offering comfort. Grief dulls your senses. Grief makes you grateful for anyone who reaches out a hand, and that is precisely when certain people choose to make their move. Birch. It happened right after a funeral in our family. The loss was fresh, the heavy weight still hanging in the air. Everyone kept telling me to let them know if I needed anything, as if polite words could put a shattered life back together. I was the one holding the keys, sorting the mail, and taking all the calls. Birch. I was the rock everyone counted on, because whenever things fell apart, I was the one who held the line. I did not have extra money for lawyers, and I barely had the energy to argue. All I had was a kitchen table, a pile of unpaid bills, and a heart that kept forgetting to beat normally. They showed up on a weekday morning. Birch. Their car was spotless, and they were dressed like they were heading to Sunday service. Delphine Carter was among them, younger back then, but already polished, already wearing that soft pearl-like mask that makes people drop their guard. Harold stayed right beside her like a shadow. Evan carried a cardboard box, pretending he was there to help move things. Birch. Julian stood in the back with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor to hide any sign of what they were really after. Delphine hugged me like family and told me how sorry they were, promising they would handle the hardest parts for me. She said it like it was a gift. She sat down without asking, as if coming in the name of comfort gave her full authority over my home. Birch. Then she set that folder down with both hands, careful and deliberate. It is standard procedure, she told me. It protects you. It protects the whole family. It keeps everything organized. Organized. There was that word again. She explained in calm, simple terms that the documents were just meant to manage affairs, avoid confusion, and make sure nobody took advantage of the situation. Birch. She talked as if she was rescuing me. I remember how desperately I wanted to believe her. I remember nodding along like a child being taught proper manners. She tapped a manicured nail against the signature line and told me I did not even need to read every page, that it was all just a formality, and they would walk me through it step by step. The way she said, formality made my stomach knot up. Birch. But grief does strange things to your mind. It makes you doubt your own instincts because everything inside you already feels wrong. I signed a page. I initialed another. I did it because she kept reassuring me it was for my peace of mind. I did it because Harold kept nodding slowly, like a respectable gentleman confirming an honest deal. Birch. I did it because Evan was watching my hands instead of my face. I did it because Julian handed me a glass of water, looking gentle while treating me like I was fragile. The moment Delphine took that folder back and slid it into her bag, the atmosphere shifted. Her smile never moved, but the warmth behind it vanished completely. Good, she said softly, her voice carrying a heavy, settled weight. Birch. Now we can move forward. Weeks later, when the fog finally cleared from my head, I took copies of what I had signed to Marianne Ellis, an attorney who specialized in trusts and deeds. Marianne read through the paperwork without blinking, and by the time she reached the final page, her lips were pressed into a tight line. Birch. She did not make me feel foolish, and that was how I knew just how bad it really was. "This document signs over your authority," she told me calmly, using the voice of a doctor looking at an X-ray. She pointed out the clause stating I agreed to place the assets under their temporary management, except there was no expiration date. She showed me legal jargon disguised as protection that was nowhere near standard procedure. Protection. Organized. Formality. I learned a lesson that day I will never forget. People do not always take what is yours by force. Sometimes they take it by making you feel like asking questions is rude. It took me months of legal battles to undo what I had signed. I spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, shuddering at how close I had come to losing everything I worked so hard to protect. I never forgot Delphine's words. I never forgot the way she smiled while my pen touched the paper, or how hard she tried to make me feel safe. That was why, 2 days before Leora's wedding, hearing Delphine laugh softly and tell the wedding planner that they liked to keep things organized because it was standard procedure for their family turned my chest cold and froze my hands in place. I did not raise Leora like a wealthy heiress. I taught her to be careful, to count every dollar, to save every receipt, and to watch her step around people whose smiles are too wide. That kind of upbringing teaches a child to be grateful without being blind. When people hear a figure like $200 million, they picture champagne, flashing lights, and a spoiled, privileged girl. That was never us. That massive sum was tucked behind a closed door, locked away in legal documents that were never left on kitchen counters, wrapped in an absolute ironclad silence. The money did not fall from the sky, and it did not come from a lottery ticket. It came from land our family had held for generations, land that looked completely ordinary, the kind people drive past without ever slowing down. It was the middle of nowhere, until people in suits started showing up with maps and asking questions. Over the years, energy companies started sending polite letters with discreet acquisition offers. They were not reaching out of kindness. They reached out because of what lay deep underground, mineral rights and long-term land leases capable of generating steady cash flow for decades to come. It was the kind of wealth that never flaunts itself with luxury, but builds quietly like underground pressure. Lease fees, renewals, and royalties that grew with the market. Nobody bragged about it. The first time I heard the finals appraisal number, the number that made my knees weak, I did not cheer. I locked the paperwork in a drawer, sat in the dark, and waited until my breathing leveled out. Wealth that arrives quietly can be taken just as quietly. That was why everything was sealed tight. I set up a family trust to hold every single dollar generated by that land, strictly safeguarding its final beneficiary. It was like a tree forgotten in the backyard, growing slowly at first, and then suddenly standing taller than the roof. Over time, its value kept climbing because it was never drained by bad decisions or sudden emergencies. It was never paraded around in flashy accounts. It was structured in layers, heavily protected, treated as a generational legacy rather than a trophy. Nobody around us knew, because they had no reason to know. Leora went to public school. She worked regular jobs. She wore simple clothes to church. She learned to say no thank you politely, and she learned to keep her contentment to herself. Without even realizing it, the trust had taught her discipline. I gave her a normal life, because a normal life is the best armor there is. When people think you are ordinary, they do not study you. They do not calculate your next move. They do not weigh your silence. That quiet life is the safest shield a woman can have. Years ago, Marianne Ellis told me in that steady professional voice she used whenever trouble was on the horizon, that silence is not just a personal choice. Silence can carry legal weight. It can be a strategy. It is often the single factor that decides whether you keep control or smile while handing it away. She did not confuse me with fancy legal terms, and she never talked down to me. She simply said that the moment anyone outside the trust tries to tie themselves to the assets, things get dangerous very fast. Trouble does not start with open theft, she warned me. It starts with gaining access. It starts with assumptions. Orch. It begins the moment a family genuinely believes they have a right to touch wealth they never helped build. I looked at Leora, seeing how love makes a young woman let her guard down. How a wedding makes someone believe everything ahead will be pure, sacred, and protected by good intentions. I watched Delphine wrap herself around Leora like a silk ribbon, tightening quietly when nobody was looking. Orch. Deep down, I knew the real danger was not the money itself. The danger was how marriage shifts people's sense of entitlement. Marriage makes certain people believe they already hold the key before the lock is even turned. It convinces them that your private matters are now family business, making them feel entitled to step into rooms they have no business entering. Orch. That evening, Leora sat on my living room couch after the rehearsal lunch was over. Her hair was pinned up, her face showing that quiet exhaustion brides get after being hugged and touched all day long. She leaned forward, wringing her hands, and said, "So the trust fund is real. You did not just warn me because you dislike her." Orch. I met her eyes and kept my voice steady, because the truth only lands when it is spoken with absolute calm. "It is real," I said, and I kept it quiet on purpose. Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for something safe to say. I did not give her room to romanticize it into blind trust, nor did I let her dismiss it as paranoia. I laid it out with the gravity it deserved. Orch. Marriage changes everything, sweetheart. It does not just change a woman's last name. It changes the way people look at what she owns. It changes what they dare to ask for, and it changes what they feel entitled to touch. I watched Leora sit there, hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying hard to keep her composure. Orch. Outside, the Seattle rain tapped against the glass in a steady rhythm, soft as a warning. Inside, the room felt tight, as though the walls themselves were listening. Leora was not afraid of the wedding. She was afraid of disappointing people. I had seen that fear swallow young women whole. It makes them sign papers they never read. It makes them smile when they should stay silent. Orch. It makes them confuse keeping the peace with giving up their power. I leaned in, lowering my voice, not out of fear, but because truth sinks in deeper when it is delivered without anger. "There is a window," I told her. "A window that opens the second the vows are finished. During that time, people start acting like what is yours belongs to everyone." Orch. Leora narrowed her eyes slightly, trying to grasp what I meant. I could tell her mind wanted a simple rule to follow, a checklist to keep everything safe. Life does not work that way. "People do not show up to take what is yours wearing masks," I said. "They show up carrying warm casseroles. They show up with tight hugs." Orch. They throw around words like family, standard procedure, protection, and doing what is best for you. They use love as a key, and marriage makes that key look completely legitimate. It is not that the law suddenly turns against you the moment you get married. It is that people use the idea of marriage to rush you. Orch. They act like time is running out, like the paperwork is urgent, like signing your name is just a harmless formality. They make you feel childish for hesitating and rude for asking for a single day to think it over. That is how mistakes happen. Not inside a courtroom, but in a cozy living room where someone with a warm smile slides a pen right into your hand. Orch. Leora shifted on the couch, her fingers gripping each other tightly. "Julian would never do that," she said. The words lacked conviction. She sounded hesitant, as if trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince me. I did not argue with her. I did not insult her husband. Orch. I let her keep the softness she needed to get through the next 48 hours, focusing directly on where the real threat was waiting. "I am not calling him a monster," I said. "I am telling you his mother knows exactly how to make her move while everyone is distracted." Leora's jaw tightened. Orch. She looked down at her engagement ring, twisting it slightly as if checking to see if it still fit the same way. "I never told her anything," she murmured. "Not about the trust, not about the land, nothing." "Good," I said, feeling a wave of relief wash over my chest. Keep it that way. Silence is not just keeping quiet. Silence is control. Silence is leverage. Silence is a locked door. If you speak too soon, you do not just give them information. You give them time to plan. You give them time to consult lawyers and build a strategy that looks completely respectful while backing you right into a corner. That was why I warned her before the wedding. Not after. After the wedding is too late. After the wedding, you are already playing defense. Leora swallowed hard. I could see the bride in her trying to take over again, the part that wanted to be generous, the part that wanted peace at all costs. Delphine keeps calling me our girl, she said softly, sounding almost embarrassed. She sounds so proud when she says it. I gave a single nod. That is not pride, I told her. That is a rehearsal. I felt Leora put her guard up, soften, and then put it right back up again. It broke my heart watching her struggle, knowing that every woman eventually reaches the crossroads where love pulls in one direction and intuition pulls in the other. It is the moment she either learns to stand her ground or spends years making excuses until the damage is already done. I reached out and covered her hand, not squeezing, just offering a steady anchor. You do not have to fight anyone, I told her. You do not have to throw accusations. You do not have to let fear ruin your wedding day. She looked up at me, eyes wide and glistening with tears, but her gaze was steady. What do I do then? She whispered. I held her gaze until she stopped looking for reassurance and started listening for direction. You do nothing, I said. You stay quiet, and you let them show you exactly who they are. Leora caught her breath, and in that small pause I could tell she understood. I leaned in close, the same way I used to when the world got too loud for her as a little girl. Listen to me carefully, I said, making sure every word settled deep, where she could never forget it. If anyone comes to you with paperwork after the wedding, you do not sign a thing. I never viewed Delphine Carter's motives the way people view villains in movies. Villains usually give a big confession, cause a scene, or let their masks slip in front of an entire room. Delphine did not operate like that. Delphine moved like a woman who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. She disguised greed behind words that sounded like family values. She wrapped control in such polished manners that anyone could mistake it for genuine care. That was why people adored her. That was why the church ladies whispered about how well-bred the Carters were, as if good manners were the same thing as goodness. I had watched her long enough to realize she was not chasing money like a desperate gambler. She was collecting it, as though it naturally belonged in her hands. The rehearsal dinner was held in a softly lit private dining room, the linen napkins folded into swans. Leora sat next to Julian, wearing that specific smile a bride learns after being embraced by 50 different people in one night. Delphine sat directly across from them, angled perfectly, her voice carrying just enough to draw polite laughter without ever sounding loud. Harold sat beside her like a rubber stamp. Evan scrolled through his phone, smirking at his screen, and only chiming in when Delphine gave him a look. From the outside, they looked like a happy, balanced, respectable family. But I had lived long enough to never buy into the image people put on display for an audience. Delphine did not ask Leora how she was feeling. She asked about the seating chart. She did not ask what kind of marriage they wanted to build. She talked about staying aligned and getting off to a proper start. Her conversations always circled back to the same words: order, structure, standard, family. Every sentence was a low fence, and right in the middle of it sat my bright-eyed granddaughter, trying her hardest to be gracious. Halfway through dinner, Delphine leaned in, resting her fork on the edge of her plate as if pausing to share some great wisdom. Marriage is a partnership, she said, smiling at the wedding planner before looking at Leora, and then at me, as if including me was an act of charity. Not just of hearts, but of assets, responsibilities, everything. People forget that, but in our family, we never do. The way she said our family made it sound like joining them came with binding obligations, as though a young bride's individuality was something to be softened, blended, and put to use. Leora gave a polite smile. Julian nodded the exact way he always did whenever his mother spoke, completely mechanical and well-trained. Orch. I watched him keep that pleasant expression even while his eyes wandered elsewhere. He never argued, he never interrupted, he let her control the room and set the tone. That told me everything about the life he was used to living. After dinner, as guests stood up to mingle, Delphine glided toward Leora with the quiet determination of someone claiming her territory. Orch. Sweetheart, she said, touching Leora's wrist gently. After the wedding, we will do a quick family follow-up. Nothing heavy, just a brief sit-down to make sure you are both properly protected. Protected. The word sounded so soft, almost loving. It was also a weapon. Leora's shoulders tensed for a second before relaxing again. Orch. A follow-up, she repeated, keeping her smile intact the way brides do when they do not want to seem ungrateful. Delphine nodded with a warm expression that never reached her eyes. Just standard procedure, she said. It will give you peace of mind. Everything moves so fast right after the wedding, so it is best to get the formalities out of the way immediately. Orch. Then you two can simply enjoy being newlyweds. Formalities. Standard procedure. Immediately. The pieces clicked together beneath my feet like familiar stones. I did not have to guess her intentions anymore. Delphine truly believed marriage turned a woman's private life into public property. She believed that once the vows were spoken, the family became a board of directors. Orch. I could hear it in the way she spoke of protection, where protection meant control, and control meant entitlement. She was not waiting for Leora to offer anything. She was preparing to take what she believed was already within reach. She thought it would be effortless because she had done it before. Orch. I saw it in her unshakable confidence, in how easily she referenced legal paperwork as if it were a family tradition. I saw it in the way Harold nodded along out of habit, and in the bored smirk on Evan's face, like he already knew how the story ended. Youth and love add up to blind trust, and that was exactly what Delphine was counting on. Orch. She was relying on the vulnerability that follows a wedding day, banking on my granddaughter caring more about keeping the peace than protecting her own ground. Leora glanced at me from across the room, her smile still in place, but her eyes silently asking me what to do. I met her gaze and gave the slightest shake of my head, a clear signal not to agree to anything, not even out of politeness. Orch. Delphine caught the exchange. Her smile sharpened for a fraction of a second before softening again as she gave Leora's wrist an affectionate squeeze. We will call you, she said sweetly. Just a quick family follow-up after the wedding. The wedding itself was flawless, the kind of perfection that only serious money and meticulous planning can buy. Orch. Clean lines, soft lighting, and music flowing through the venue like water. White flowers climbed the walls as if they had grown there naturally. Every chair perfectly aligned toward the altar, waiting to witness something sacred. People smiled freely that day, the kind of easy smiles that come from believing everything important has finally fallen into place. Orch. Leora walked toward Julian with a steady grace that made my chest ache, her dress trailing behind her, like it knew the long road she had taken to reach this moment. I watched her face, searching not for nerves, but for doubt. There was none, only trust. That is what love gives you on your wedding day, a soft place to land. Orch. Delphine sat in the front row, hands neatly folded, chin tilted up, a single tear resting perfectly at the corner of her eye. She dabbed it away gently, putting on a show of emotion for anyone watching. Harold leaned over to whisper something, making her smile without looking away. Evan glanced around the room, visibly bored with the whole thing. Orch. Julian waited at the altar, hands clasped, standing tall like a man trained on exactly where to stand and when to nod. When Delphine had reached out to adjust his jacket before the ceremony, he had yielded without hesitation. He always yielded to her. That was what struck me the most. Not cruelty, not force, but compliance. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Orch. The vows were clear, the promises firm. Applause rolled through the room like a wave, and for a second, even I felt that familiar tug, the quiet relief that comes when a heavy burden finally feels settled. As Leora and Julian turned to walk back down the aisle, she looked over and smiled at me, her eyes shining bright. Orch. I smiled right back, because I was her grandmother, and love does not disappear just because intuition is whispering a warning. The reception followed its usual rhythm. Laughter filled the air, glasses clinked, and people embraced Leora as if she belonged to them now, as if marriage had turned her into shared property. Orch. Delphine worked the room effortlessly, greeting guests, taking compliments, and talking about the family's happiness like a seasoned host delivering well-rehearsed lines. Every time she passed Julian, she placed a hand on his arm, anchoring him right where she wanted him. He never pulled away. He never stepped out of line. When she spoke, he listened. When she laughed, he laughed. Orch. When she gave a suggestion to the planner, he simply nodded along. I stood at the edge of the room watching it all, the way women my age learned to do. Quietly observing, completely unnoticed. At one point, Delphine made her way toward the gift table, her purse tucked firmly under her arm. Orch. The bag was not oversized, but it held a rigid shape, clearly carrying far more weight than a lipstick and a phone. She set it down briefly while greeting a guest, and when she shifted it, the zipper parted just enough for me to catch a glimpse inside. It was not cash, and it was not personal items. It was paper, a thick, neatly stacked bundle with razor-sharp edges. Orch. A heavy folder pressed tightly against the lining of the bag, its stiff corners unmistakable. My heart did not race. If anything, it slowed down. That is the quiet calm that comes when you have already been warned, the stillness of recognizing an exact pattern, rather than reacting to a sudden shock. Orch. Delphine quickly zipped the bag shut and returned to her bright smiles, but the weight of what I had seen stayed heavy on my mind. Across the room, Leora and Julian were swaying on the dance floor, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand steady against her back. They looked genuinely happy. They really did. That is the cruelest part about moments like this. Orch. Danger does not arrive looking like danger, it arrives wrapped in music, celebration, and joy. Later in the evening, during the toasts, Delphine stood up, raised her glass, and spoke in that warm, steady tone about family, unity, and how marriage is not just the union of two people, but the joining of two legacies. The word legacy lingered in the air a second longer than it should have. Orch. Leora did not catch it. Julian took his mother's hand right after the toast, his face glowing with gratitude, without glancing in my direction even once. As the night wore on, guests began filtering out with tired laughs and warm hugs, holding their shoes in their hands and promising to stay in touch. The lights dimmed, and the music faded into a soft murmur. Orch. Leora hugged me tightly, whispering a heartfelt thank you into my shoulder, the scent of fresh flowers and perfume lingering in her hair. Delphine watched us from across the room, wearing a calm, deeply satisfied smile. Orch. When the heavy doors finally closed behind the last guest, the room suddenly felt hollow and quiet, like a house where the real unspoken conversation only begins after everyone else has gone home. The morning after the wedding did not carry any obvious warning signs. Orch. There were just leftover containers, soft morning light, and that quiet exhaustion behind your eyes that settles in after 12 straight hours of smiling for cameras. Leora and Julian had stayed in a downtown hotel suite the night before. Naturally, it had been a gift from Delphine, arranged with the same refined, controlling elegance she brought to everything else. Orch. But early that morning, Leora showed up at my front door, still carrying that newlywed glow, her hair tied in a loose knot, holding her shoes in one hand just like the girl who had grown up under my roof. She told me she wanted to grab a quiet breakfast with her grandma, anything simple, before heading back to Julian for the brunch his family had planned. Orch. The word flashed in my mind like a warning light that refused to turn off. Leora sat at my kitchen table, sipping her tea, her eyes half open with fatigue. She looked so peaceful. It was that exact peace that made my stomach knot up, because peace is the very disguise someone uses when they want you to let your guard down. I watched her run her thumb along the edge of her napkin, keeping her gentle smile even as her phone buzzed on the wood. It was Delphine calling again. Leora did not answer. She let it ring until it went silent, offering an apologetic excuse about how excited Delphine was, and how she was just trying to be generous. That is what young brides do. They convince themselves that if they stay sweet enough, everyone around them will treat them with that same sweetness. I set a plate of eggs and toast in front of her and took the seat opposite, keeping every movement slow and deliberate. I did not want to startle her. I needed her instincts sharp. "Do you remember what I told you?" I asked softly. Leora kept her smile, but her eyes flickered. It was the physical reaction of a body acknowledging a warning that the heart wants to ignore. "I remember," she murmured. I did not say a word. "Good," I said. The word tasted like a mix of relief and dread. Silence does not stop someone from trying. It just forces desperate people to show their hand that much faster. I did not need to guess why Delphine was moving with such urgency. I had seen plenty of women like her in my life. When they believe they hold leverage, they do not wait around for permission. Marriage simply gives them a convenient excuse to rush you. In their minds, the first day after the vows are spoken is when you are at your most vulnerable. You are still floating, still soft, still desperate to protect that fragile new peace. You have not had time to process anything. You have not had a chance to ask anyone outside the circle what any of it actually means. That is the gamble. They bet on the bride being too timid to look suspicious, and they bet on the groom refusing to challenge his mother before the ink on the marriage license is even dry. After a couple of bites, Leora pushed her plate away, her appetite fading the way it always does when something heavy enters the room. "Julian mentioned his mom likes to handle the administrative details," she said, repeating the phrase like a compliment before pausing, as if hearing it out loud made it sound slightly off. "He said she wants us to be organized right from the start." Organized. I felt my jaw tighten just a fraction. "Organized right from the start," I repeated, keeping my tone completely neutral, the way you hold a shield behind your back. "That is what she called it." Leora nodded. "She said she does not want things to get messy down the road." Messy. Another word people love to drop right before pushing you to sign your name. I leaned back in my chair, fixing my gaze just past Leora's shoulder so she would not read too much alarm on my face. The truth was, I already understood the mechanics of Delphine's plan, even without seeing the paperwork. Someone like Delphine would never lead with an attorney. An attorney invites questions. An attorney creates a paper trail that can be contested. An attorney makes things official enough to demand breathing room. Delphine did not want breathing room. She wanted speed. She wanted pressure delivered without room for debate. That was why she would bring a notary. A notary does not sit down to explain clauses or offer advice. A notary simply shows up on time, smiles politely, checks your identification, and waits for your signature. The mere presence of a notary makes people feel as though the decision has already been settled, as if hesitating is rude or childish, and asking for time to think is an embarrassing inconvenience. A notary carries a quick stamp of authority, enough to demand compliance without inviting a real conversation. I had seen the tactic before. Bringing a notary is like bringing a personal witness, designed to make you feel outnumbered, to make you feel like the entire room is aligned against you, and to turn your hesitation into an overreaction. The first 24 to 72 hours after a wedding are when the trick works best, right when a bride is trying hardest to prove she belongs in her new family. Leora's fingers tightened around her mug. "Grandma," she asked softly, her voice much smaller than it was yesterday, Do you think she is bringing papers? I looked her dead in the eye, steady and calm. I think she is bringing something designed to look completely harmless, I said, and I think she is going to push you to sign it immediately. Leora swallowed hard. For the first time since walking through the door, the newlywed glow vanished completely. She was just my granddaughter again, young, trusting, and trying desperately to keep her footing on shaking ground. I reached across the table and covered her hand. If anyone asks you to sign anything today, I said, pronouncing every syllable with total clarity, you do not sign. You do not offer explanations. You do not argue. You simply state that you need time. She nodded, but her gaze drifted, already feeling the weight of the coming pressure. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the silence. The hallway outside remained still. Then, a sharp, sudden ring of the doorbell shattered the quiet. The second I opened the door, I knew it was not a neighbor, a delivery driver, or a well-wishing relative dropping by with congratulations. It was a formation. Delphine stood front and center, treating the entryway like her personal territory. Her pearls caught the light, and her smile was already firmly locked into place. Harold stood right beside her, hands clasped, looking perfectly composed. Evan leaned back slightly, holding his phone as if watching a casual performance. Julian hovered at the perimeter, dressed neatly in casual clothes, looking like a man instructed on how to appear reasonable. Beside them stood a man I had never seen before, carrying a leather portfolio as if holding a sacred text. His posture was polite and completely detached, that specific brand of professional neutrality that pretends it has no part in whatever damage is about to unfold. Delphine's eyes swept past me, landing directly on Leora behind my shoulder, treating my presence like a minor obstacle. "Good morning," she said with practiced warmth. We did not mean to interrupt, but we happened to be in the neighborhood. In the neighborhood. That is what people always say when they do not want Yoon to know how carefully they planned their arrival. Leora stepped up beside me, still holding her tea mug, as if she had forgotten it was in her hand. Her eyes drifted to the leather portfolio before snapping back to Delphine's smile. Her arm brushed against mine, and I felt the faint tremble in her skin. Delphine gestured with an open hand. "Sweetheart, this will only take 5 minutes," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness designed to control the pace of the entire room. "It is just a routine formality." The stranger cleared his throat, offering a courteous nod. "Calvin H. Brooks," he introduced himself professionally. "I am a licensed notary." His voice had that flat, routine tone of a public official, calm and completely devoid of emotion. Delphine turned toward him like someone presenting a gift. "Our family has always relied on Mr. Brooks for our private affairs," she said. "He is exceptionally dependable." Dependable. Another soft word used to smother your instincts. Harold gave a slow nod of silent agreement. Julian avoided looking at Leora, staring instead at the wall behind me, as though avoiding eye contact excused him from taking any responsibility. Leora tightened her grip on the mug. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Delphine gave a soft laugh as if Leora had asked the most adorable question. "Oh, darling," she said, stepping forward. Her expensive perfume filled the doorway, thick and intrusive. "It is just our post-wedding estate protocol. Every family has their way of ensuring a solid foundation. We just want to make sure our children are properly protected, our children." I watched Leora's face soften with that familiar longing for acceptance. Delphine knew exactly which buttons to press. The notary shifted the portfolio under his arm and produced a small ink pad, moving casually, like someone who had performed this exact routine in countless living rooms where confused people simply smiled, nodded, and signed. Without waiting for an invitation, Delphine walked straight in, her heels clicking against my floor. Harold followed close behind, Evan sauntered in after, and Julian crossed the threshold like a man entering a church. "Let us sit down," Delphine said, already heading toward my dining table, as if she owned the house. My kitchen table, where Leora had been eating breakfast 20 minutes earlier, had just been turned into a boardroom. Porch. Delphine set a thick stack of documents down and smoothed the top page with her palm, the sound of paper scraping wood loud in the heavy silence. Leora stood near the edge of the room, clutching her mug, blinking slowly, as her mind struggled to keep up with the speed of what was happening. I did not say a word yet. I watched. Porch. I watched Delphine place the papers directly in front of Leora's chair rather than mine. I watched Harold take up a position behind Delphine's shoulder like an official witness. I watched Evan lean against the counter with a faint smirk, and I watched Julian linger near Leora, close but not close enough to stand up for her. Delphine's smile widened. Porch. Now that your marriage is legally recognized, we just need your signature to confirm the shared marital assets and spousal beneficiary designations. She delivered the line smoothly, as if she had practiced it in a mirror 100 times, framing it not as a maneuver, but as a harmless family custom. Leora drew a short breath. Porch. Setting her mug carefully on the counter with a trembling hand, she walked toward the table, guided by the invisible leash of polite upbringing she had worn her entire life. Calvin Brooks unzipped his folder, setting out his notary seal and stamp with quiet precision, adding an official finality that had no business being in a private home. Porch. Delphine slid the top page forward and tapped the signature line with her fingernail. Right here, sweetheart, she said in a hushed, almost motherly tone. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a pen she had brought specifically for this moment, and placed it right in front of Leora. The pen sat there like bait, small and ordinary, pretending it had no edge. Porch. Leora stared at the pen for a second too long, and Delphine noticed immediately. She shifted her tone, making it even softer and more intimate, the way people do when trying to guide you without seeming demanding. Sweetheart, she murmured, resting her hand lightly on the paperwork as if reviewing it for Leora's benefit. This is just how mature adults protect the life they are building together. Porch. It is really no big deal. No big deal. Words engineered to make you feel foolish for hesitating. Harold added his quiet paternal reassurance from behind her. It is just an added layer of security, he said. You are starting a new life. You will thank us down the road. Evan let out a dry chuckle, acting as though the whole thing were completely routine. Do not make it dramatic. Porch. Everyone does this, he said, tapping his phone before sliding it into his pocket. It is standard procedure, standard procedure. The phrase hung in the air like thick smoke. Leora swallowed, her throat moving. She did not reach for the pen, but she did not push it away either. Porch. She looked over at Julian, her husband, waiting for him to meet her eyes, waiting for him to say something that would give her room to breathe. Julian glanced briefly at the documents and looked away, fixing his eyes on the far corner of the room, pretending that staring at the wall meant he did not have to choose between his mother and his wife. Porch. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, fingers twisted together, his jaw working slowly as if trying to swallow something bitter. Delphine cut her eyes toward him, and he offered a tiny, mechanical nod. That silent nod spoke louder than any words he could have managed. Leora's shoulders dropped slightly as her body absorbed a hard truth she did not want to accept. Porch. Delphine seized the opening, leaning in with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. It is just paperwork, she said. You are not giving anything away. You are simply confirming what marriage has already created. She said what marriage has already created, as if the terms had been dictated by someone older and wiser who never needed anyone's permission. Porch. Calvin Brooks cleared his throat with professional caution. Ma'am, he said to Leora. This is a very straightforward signing. I just need to verify your identification and witness your signature. Straightforward. Another word meant to quiet her intuition. Leora glanced at me for a split second, quick as a heartbeat, before looking back down at the page. She was trying to keep her composure. Porch. She was trying not to offend anyone. She was trying to be the good bride Delphine had spent months praising. That was why they were so confident. They were confident because they thought they had her completely figured out. They believed she would choose politeness over self-preservation in her own home. Porch. They counted on gratitude to keep her trapped, on love to keep her compliant, and on her youth to keep her from knowing how to say no without apologizing. Delphine's smile grew, the warmth turning into quiet triumph. "We are doing this because we care about you both," she said, treating urgent pressure like an act of devotion. "We do it right now because certain things cannot wait." Porch. When people hesitate, they get confused. They start listening to outsiders. Outsiders. She meant me, without even having the courage to say my name. Harold stepped an inch closer, his presence looming over the table. "There is no need to make this complicated," he said mildly, though the mildness sounded like a warning. Evan tilted his head toward Leora, keeping his tone casual and dismissive. "Porch, come on, do not turn this into a whole scene. It is totally normal. Another invisible chain. Leora parted her lips, looking as though she wanted to speak, but unsure what words would keep the room calm. Her fingers hovered over the pen, trembling with that specific hesitation of a hand being pushed to do something the mind rejects. Porch. Julian shifted his weight from one foot to the other, remaining completely silent, entirely absent in the one moment his wife needed him to stand up. Delphine caught the hesitation and pivoted instantly, sweetening her voice once again. "You are exhausted," she cooed softly. "You have been through so much this week. Just sign it, sweetheart, and we will get out of your hair so you can rest." Porch. "You certainly do not want your marriage starting out with conflict." Conflict, there it was. The threat hidden inside a lullaby. Starting out with conflict, as if refusing to sign an unread legal document was the source of the tension, rather than the family who had ambushed her living room with a notary. Leora's hand drifted an inch closer to the pen. Her breathing grew shallow. Porch. Her eyes glistened with tears. She fought desperately to hold back, trying so hard to be accommodating. Delphine watched that struggle the way a hunter watches an injured deer. The room held its breath, the only sound being the faint rustle of the portfolio as Calvin prepared to witness the signing. Right then, something settled inside me, heavy, resolute, and clear. Porch. I took a single step forward, close enough for Leora to feel my presence without touching her, and spoke for the very first time. My voice was not raised. It did not shake. It came out low and steady, carrying the weight of a woman who had seen through false masks a long time ago. "Before she signs a single thing," I said, "I need one point of clarification." Porch. Delphine kept her smile, but her eyes narrowed in an instant. She turned toward me as if I had just stepped directly in front of a moving car. "Marlowe," she said softly, velvet wrapping around a sharp warning, "this is entirely unnecessary." I did not answer her. My eyes looked past her, past Harold's composed posture, past Evan's smirk, past Julian's silence, locking squarely onto Calvin Brooks. Porch. In this country, a licensed notary does not carry loud authority, but their role carries real legal weight. That power comes from the assumption that they are entirely neutral. But when an impartial witness is used as a tool in someone else's scheme, their position becomes very fragile. "Mr. Brooks," I asked, respectful but completely firm, "exactly which trust is named in those documents?" Porch. The question landed heavily in the room because it was not part of the script they had brought through my front door. Delphine blinked slowly, her smile freezing, as she calculated whether to brush me off or shut me down. Harold's stance shifted. Evan's smirk faltered, forced into an awkward grin. Julian's eyes snapped to me in genuine shock before dropping back to the floor. Porch. Calvin hesitated for half a second, the instinct of a seasoned professional realizing the temperature in the room had just changed. "Ma'am," he replied politely, "these documents reference the Green Family Trust." He said it with complete certainty, like reading a label, as though naming the entity out loud made it theirs to claim. Porch. Leora caught her breath, turning her head slowly toward me with wide eyes, shock and sudden realization competing on her face. Delphine tilted her chin up slightly. "That is correct. she said, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. "We are simply ensuring everything is properly affirmed. It is completely standard." Standard. Orch. She was trying to push the conversation back onto familiar ground, dismissing my question as a minor inconvenience. I did not let her. My focus never left Calvin, because the truth was not in Delphine's mouth. It was sitting in the legal text on that table. "Thank you," I said to Calvin. Then I turned my attention directly to Delphine. "That trust was dissolved yesterday." Orch. The air in the room vanished. There was no shouting. Nobody smashed a glass. The reaction was far quieter and much more telling. Evan's eyebrows shot up before he could mask his expression. Harold's nostrils flared with barely contained irritation. Julian's lips parted as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Delphine froze for a solid second. Orch. In that fraction of time, her smile turned into something else entirely, tight and paper, then like a mask pulled over a deep crack. "That is not possible," she began, catching herself before pivoting. "Marlowe, you clearly have no idea what you are talking about." Her voice took on a sharper tone, attempting to force me back into my lane. I did not take the bait. I did not raise my voice. Orch. I let my steady calm do the work. "I know exactly what I am talking about," I said, speaking with the quiet certainty of someone who had prepared for this exact moment for years. Leora's chair scraped faintly against the floor as she pulled back from the table, distancing herself from the paperwork as if the pages were dangerous. Calvin's eyes drifted back down to the first page. Orch. Delphine caught the movement and leaned forward quickly, pressing her palm flat against the documents as if trying to hold her reality in place by physical force. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice rushing to regain its smooth sweetness, "everything is in order. All of this is standard. We have executed similar documents before." Similar documents before. Right there, she let the truth slip. Orch. Calvin did not answer her. He picked up the first page, then the second, his thumb tracing the margin with professional caution. He was not judging the family. He was evaluating his own legal liability. I kept my eyes on him, because the moment a neutral party senses personal risk, the room's manufactured certainty falls apart completely. Orch. "Ma'am," he said, looking up at me and slowing his pace, "what exactly do you mean by dissolved?" Delphine's head snapped toward him, eyes flashing with anger. I answered calmly. "Not for Delphine, not for Harold, not for Evan, and not even for Julian. I answered for Leora, so she would understand that her hesitation had been justified all along, and that her silence had been her strongest defense." Orch. "I mean, the paperwork in your hands is tied to an outdated structure that no longer exists," I told him. "If you move forward without verifying that, your notary seal is going on an invalid instrument." Delphine drew in a sharp breath through her nose, the sound of furious, tightly wound restraint. Harold placed a hand on her elbow, steadying her, silently reminding her to keep her composure. Orch. Evan completely forgot about the phone in his pocket. Julian stared at the papers as though they had turned into a foreign language he could no longer pretend to understand. Calvin looked down again, flipping to the section, listing the legal entities and scanning line by line with total concentration. The room had lost every bit of its polished confidence. Orch. The certainty they had marched in with was draining away, page by page, right onto my kitchen table. Calvin's brow furrowed. He turned back to the first page, and then the second, reading the fine print far more deliberately this time. The silence grew heavy while Calvin Brooks reviewed the text, thick enough to press against the walls. He was in no hurry now. Orch. He took his time, the way people do when they realize a careless mistake could cost them down the line. His finger traced a line of text, paused, and then flipped back and forth between the pages. The crisp sound of paper turning echoed sharply through the room. Delphine shifted her stance, the heel of her shoe clicking against the floor before catching herself. Orch. Harold leaned in slightly, trying to read over Calvin's shoulder without looking obvious. Evan crossed his arms, his smirk replaced by restless agitation. Julian stood frozen, staring at the folder as if it held answers to questions he had never bothered to ask until today. Leora did not move a muscle. She stood with her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles pale against her skin. Her breathing was steady and quiet. She was listening, and that was everything. Calvin cleared his throat. "There is a provision here," he began, measuring each word carefully as he tapped the page, referencing a successor trust structure that activates automatically upon marriage. Delphine's lips parted and pressed tight again. "Yes," she said quickly, leaning forward. "That is standard protocol. It simply means the records need to be brought up to date." Calvin did not look at her. "According to the explicit language here," he continued, his tone professional and stripped of any casual routine, "the original trust dissolved the moment the marriage was finalized, and a successor entity immediately took its place." Leora tilted her head slightly, her mind processing the legal reality before the rest of the room could react. I looked at Delphine. The tension in her shoulders was visible beneath her jacket. "Dissolved," Harold repeated, his voice low and sharp. Calvin nodded. "That is what the document states." He glanced up briefly before looking right back down. "And the successor structure contains much stricter limitations." Stricter limitations. The phrase landed hard on the table. Delphine let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded completely forced. "Stricter in what way?" she demanded. The sweet facade stretched to its breaking point. Calvin turned another page. "It explicitly defines scope of beneficiaries." He paused, reading a specific clause in silence longer than necessary, an intentional pause that changed the entire weight of his voice when he spoke again. "Spouses are explicitly excluded. In-laws are explicitly excluded as well." The air left Delphine's lungs in a sharp exhale. Harold straightened up completely, visible anger taking over his posture. Evan let his arms drop heavily to his sides. Julian finally looked at Leora, his face pale and drained, filled with sheer disbelief. Leora did not return his look. She kept her eyes fixed on Calvin, absorbing every single word like an anchor holding her steady in a storm. Delphine fought to regain control. "That cannot be right," she said firmly. "We were informed." She stopped herself, her eyes darting toward me before snapping back to Calvin. "This is just a standard confirmation. Nobody is trying to take anything." Calvin adjusted his glasses. "There is also a specific enforcement clause regarding coercion," he said, his voice dropping lower, pulling everyone in the room closer. "It states that any attempt to pressure, compel, or rush the beneficiary into modifying, affirming, or transferring trust assets triggers an immediate forfeiture of any future claims or rights by the offending party." Leora let out a sharp breath, caught between shock and absolute relief. Julian took half a step toward her, then stopped dead, as though realizing he no longer had the right to cross the space between them. Delphine's expression went completely rigid. "Forfeiture," she repeated, the word scraping against her throat. Calvin nodded once more. "Yes, ma'am." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since walking through the door. "Which means that executing this acknowledgement without independent legal verification exposes everyone involved to serious legal liability." He did not need to elaborate. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward, the dining table heavy under the weight of paperwork that no longer served Delphine's agenda. I watched her closely. When polite charm fails, people always reveal who they really are. Her smile was completely gone. Her lips were pressed into a hard line. Her gaze locked onto Leora, sharp and searching desperately for a crack in my granddaughter's composure. "You knew about this all along," she said through clenched teeth, making no effort to hide the accusation. Leora did not answer. She did not have to. The truth was written right there in black and white. Harold muttered a low curse under his breath. Evan took a step back toward the hallway, instinctively putting distance between himself and the mess. Julian opened his mouth and closed it again, finally understanding that Leora's silence had been an intentional choice, and that choices carry real consequences. Porch. Calvin gathered the papers, aligning the edges with deliberate care. He slid the pen back toward his own portfolio instead of Leora. Then, with absolute finality, he closed the leather folder and snapped the latch shut. Calvin Brooks did not slam his folder. He did not storm out or raise his voice. Porch. He simply packed his tools the way someone closes a heavy door upon smelling smoke, carefully, quietly, and completely. That was the exact second Delphine lost her grip. Her entire entrance had been built on the assumption that the notary was merely a prop, a quiet, obedient rubber stamp with a pulse. In reality, when neutrality carries legal exposure, that obedience evaporates instantly. Porch. Calvin pulled the portfolio toward himself, gathering his ink pad and official seal with slow, precise movements. That simple action shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Leora's shoulders eased down, like someone bracing for an impact that was never going to land. Julian's face remained tight, his eyes darting between his mother and the notary, as if the floor beneath him had split wide open. Porch. Harold leaned forward, dropping his voice in an attempt to project authority. "Just a moment," he said. "We are not asking for anything improper. These are internal family documents. Family matters." The phrase sounded ridiculous now. Set against a strict forfeiture clause, the words family matters were as fragile as paper in deep water. Calvin met his gaze, polite but immovable. "Porch. Sir, I am not here to interpret intent," he said. "I am here to witness signatures under legally sound conditions. Legally sound conditions." Delphine tried to force a smile, but could not manage it. She stepped closer to the table, hovering her hand over the documents as though physical presence could reverse the outcome. "Mr. Porch. Brooks," she said, her voice rushing to sound smooth. "I do not understand why you are making this complicated. We handle matters like this all the time. You have notarized documents for our family before." A hint of desperation cut through her tone, implying that he had complied in the past, without asking questions. Calvin did not back down. "Porch." He looked down at the table, glanced at Leora, and looked back at Delphine, making a decision driven purely by professional self-preservation. "Ma'am," he said, "these documents cite a trust that has been restructured, and they carry explicit terms regarding coercion and forfeiture. Porch. If I witness a signature under circumstances that show clear signs of pressure, I am putting my license and personal liability on the line." Liability. That was the real bottom line. Not loyalty, not family harmony, but legal accountability. Delphine's nostrils flared, her features tightening as she tried to contain her fury. "Pressure," she scoffed, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "Porch. Nobody is pressuring her." Evan let out a faint snort, attempting to show support, but stayed glued to the counter, offering no real help. Harold clenched his jaw. Julian remained completely silent. Leora looked down at the pen, looked up at me, and finally turned her gaze to Calvin. Her eyes were completely clear now. The softness that had once made her easy to push around had vanished entirely. "Porch." Delphine saw it too, and her voice turned sharp. "Leora," she said, using my granddaughter's name like a hook, "this is a straightforward matter. Sign the confirmation and we are done. You certainly do not want your marriage starting out with suspicion." Suspicion. Porch. The word dropped like an accusation, trying to make Leora's caution look like the problem, rather than the ambush they had brought into our home. Leora parted her lips and closed them again. She did not jump in to defend herself. She did not offer an apology. She simply held her silence, but that silence had taken on an entirely new weight. Grounded, deliberate, and immovable. Porch. That kind of quiet rattled Delphine far more than an argument ever could. Calvin packed away his official seal, sliding it securely back into his portfolio. He stood up, pushing his chair back, with a soft scrape across the floorboards that echoed through the room like a signal. "I am formally stepping away from this notarization," he announced, his voice professional and completely final. "Porch. Unless I am provided with verified documentation showing that the referenced trust structure and beneficiary terms are current and legally valid, and that all parties are executing these documents willingly and free of undue influence, I cannot proceed. Delphine's polished composure fractured completely. There was no screaming, but the shift was impossible to miss. Her shoulders locked tight, her mouth set into a thin, rigid line, and the false warmth drained from her face, replaced by pure frost. "So you are just going to walk away?" she demanded. The entitlement she had worked so hard to conceal broke straight to the surface. She was no longer asking politely. She was demanding compliance. Harold stepped forward, attempting to use his physical stature to back his wife's authority. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice dropping low, "we hired you for a job." Calvin gave a slight nod, "Which is why I am officially declining to complete the assignment under these circumstances," he answered. "Any fees already paid will be refunded in full." That last sentence landed like a sharp rebuke. It was not just a refusal, it was a clean, legal boundary. He was rejecting their authority entirely. Fury flashed in Delphine's eyes. She whipped around toward Julian. "Say something," she hissed, keeping her voice low so it would not carry outside but sharp enough to cut deep. Julian swallowed hard, looking toward Leora as if expecting his wife to step in and rescue him. Leora did not budge. She stood perfectly still, watching the man who had been brought along to validate her compliance prioritize his own comfort when it mattered most. Delphine turned back toward Calvin, her voice rising as the last traces of etiquette fell away. "What does this mean for us?" The question hung in the air, caught between desperate frustration and a demand for control. Calvin gave her no comfort. He gave her an unbending wall. "It means I am not moving forward," he said with absolute detachment. "If you have questions regarding the legal implications of these documents, you will need to consult independent counsel." He did not say lawyer. He said counsel. In the professional world, that single word lands like ice water, shutting down the drama with strict legal reality. Delphine opened her mouth, but found no words. Harold's hand gripped the back of the chair tightly. Evan took another step toward the entryway, his instincts telling him that when a foundation starts crumbling, the safest place to be is near the exit. Julian looked like someone waking up inside a mess he had not built himself, but had willingly allowed to happen. Leora stood tall, her eyes locked onto Delphine, watching her the way you study a threat that has finally dropped its disguise. Calvin tucked his portfolio under his arm and stepped toward the door. He gave Leora a brief nod, followed by another toward me. It was not a gesture of taking sides, just routine professional courtesy, but it offered real protection. He was leaving with his official seal. Without that seal, Delphine's entire maneuver had no legal teeth. Do not be foolish. If you walk away from this, you leave with nothing. Your father will have every account tied to your name frozen by noon. He will call his banking contacts and ensure no legitimate venture firm in Atlanta ever reviews your business deck. You will be broke before your flight even takes off. Take the settlement, take the money, and show some basic gratitude. I stepped straight into his personal space, forcing him back a step. Listen to me carefully, Spencer. I do not want a single cent from the Pierce Empire. I do not want your hush money, and I do not want my father's conditional charity. I am leaving this house with the exact same talent and drive I brought into it. You take that check right back to my father. Tell him to use it to buy himself some integrity, because heaven knows that is the one thing he cannot afford. My parents stepped into the grand foyer just in time to hear my absolute refusal. My father's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. He was a man who operated on the absolute rule that everyone could be bought, and my refusal of his severance package was an open rejection of his authority. If you walk out that door without signing this agreement, you are entirely stripped of the Pierce name. His voice boomed across the marble floor. You will not see a penny of inheritance. You will have zero access to my professional network, and you will be completely cut off from the society that raised you. I will make sure everyone in our circle knows you walked away from your family obligations in a total breakdown. You will be nothing more than a cautionary tale." My mother stood beside him with her arms tightly crossed, looking at me with pure, undisguised disdain. "Orch. The moment your little tech venture fails, you will come crawling back," she said with a cold sneer. "You have never survived outside our protection. When the money runs out and the real world hits you, do not expect these doors to open." I gripped the handle of my suitcase. A surge of adrenaline rushed through me, wiping away every trace of grief or heartbreak. Orch. I looked at the three of them standing inside their pristine, luxury fortress. They looked remarkably small, completely hollow, their entire lives governed by balance sheets and public perception. "I am not coming back," I stated, my voice echoing off the marble with unshakable certainty. "You do not get to cast me out of a family I am actively choosing to leave. Orch. As of this second, you no longer have an eldest daughter. You have no right to speak my name, no claim on my future accomplishments, and no place in my life." I paused, making sure every word burned itself into their memory. "I am walking out of this house, and you will never know where I go, what I build, whether I marry, or how far I climb. Orch, you traded me away for a corporate merger, and now you get to live with the reality of that transaction forever." I turned my back on them for the final time. Pushing open the heavy oak doors, I stepped out into the bright morning light. The thick Atlanta summer heat hit my skin, but I had never felt clearer. I carried my bags down the stone steps, without looking back. Orch. I could hear my father shouting my name, demanding that I return, but his voice sounded distant and completely powerless. With every step down the long, winding driveway, I put distance between myself and their toxic expectations. The sprawling estate, the manicured grounds, and the suffocating wealth shrank behind me. Orch. Walking down that wide path alone with a heavy suitcase, the reality of my solitude was undeniable, but it did not break me. It fueled me. The moment I loaded my luggage into the trunk and turned the key in the ignition, an overwhelming sense of liberation took over. I was cut off. I had no safety net and no family to fall back on. Orch. I had just walked away from generational wealth to step straight into the unknown. Yet I was finally, entirely free, and that freedom was worth infinitely more than any check they could ever write. The drive along the interstate toward Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport passed in a blur of pure adrenaline. Not a single tear fell, and I never once looked in the rearview mirror. Orch. Every mile separating me from my father's gated estate felt like shedding a layer of heavy, suffocating armor I had been forced to wear for years. I left the car in the long-term parking lot, tossing the keys into the center console. My father had purchased the vehicle, and when his team eventually tracked the GPS, he could send an assistant to retrieve it. Orch. I wanted no remaining ties to his resources. Inside the sprawling terminal, the bright fluorescent lights felt clinical and detached. This was the city that demanded my compliance, and now it was the city I was leaving behind. Bypassing the automated kiosks, I walked directly to the international ticketing counter. Orch. I accessed the offshore funds I had secured the night before, a modest sum compared to the vast Pierce holdings, but money that was legally and entirely my own. Looking the agent in the eye, I purchased a one-way ticket on flight to Barcelona, Spain. The transaction wiped out a massive portion of my available funds, a stark reminder that I had discarded every traditional safety net. Orch. Yet as the machine printed that thin boarding pass, it felt like the most valuable document I had ever held in my hands. It was my formal declaration of independence. With 2 hours before boarding, I found a quiet corner near the gate. The real work had to begin immediately. My father possessed vast resources and an extensive network. Orch. If he decided to track me down, he would hire private investigators, trace digital trails, and attempt to freeze any accounts connected to his corporate reach. I needed to disappear completely. Opening my laptop and powering up my phone, the screen was instantly flooded with missed calls and messages. porch. Marcus was trying to reach me. Chloe was sending sarcastic texts mocking my exit, and my mother had left a voicemail ordering me to end this embarrassing tantrum and return home to apologize. I listened to none of it. Opening the settings, I began systematically severing every digital connection to my past. Marcus Davenport, blocked. Chloe Pierce, blocked. Spencer, blocked. My mother, blocked. Porch. My father, blocked. Next came the public platforms. I logged into every curated profile that documented my life as the Pierce family's eldest daughter, deleting the photos of charity galas, country club luncheons, and staged family portraits. I did not simply deactivate them. I deleted the accounts entirely. Porch. I wiped my cloud storage, disabled all location services, and routed my new development servers through an encrypted, virtual private network. I contacted my mobile carrier to terminate the number I had used for over a decade, removed the physical SIM card, snapped it in half, and tossed it into a trash bin. Porch. Watching the progress bars complete on my screen, every digital link to my previous life was severed for good. I was wiping the slate clean so a new foundation could be built from scratch. By the time my father realized I was truly gone, there would be no digital trail left to follow. The boarding announcement echoed across the terminal. Porch. I closed the laptop, picked up my suitcase, and walked toward the gate without a second thought. The transatlantic flight served as a necessary transition between two completely different realities. As the aircraft climbed through the clouds, leaving the humid control of the American South behind, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours finally caught up with me. Porch. To the steady hum of the jet engines, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke, the pilot was announcing our descent into Spain. I lifted the window shade to find the rigid grid of Atlanta replaced by the dynamic coastline of the Mediterranean. Stepping off the plane at El Prat Airport, the contrast was immediate. Porch. The golden Spanish sunlight felt warm and welcoming, carrying the scent of salt air, old stone, and open possibilities. The tone of my life had shifted fundamentally, moving from a cold, restrictive environment into a vibrant new space. Yet the romantic idea of starting fresh in a European city collided quickly with the reality of building a business from the ground up. Porch. I was a Black American woman in my 30s, alone in an unfamiliar country with basic Spanish skills and a bank balance that was dropping by the day. I could not afford to be a tourist, and I had no time to rest. I had to build my own future from scratch. Within 48 hours, I secured a small studio apartment in the working-class neighborhood of El Raval. Porch. It was a fifth-floor walk-up with peeling paint, temperamental plumbing, and barely enough space to open 2 suitcases at once. The single window looked out over a busy, narrow alley rather than manicured grounds. Compared to a Buckhead mansion, it was an undeniable step-down in luxury, but to me it was a sanctuary. Because it belonged entirely to me. Porch. Inside those 4 walls, no one could dictate terms to me or dismiss my ambitions. I pushed a small wooden table against the wall and unpacked my equipment. Setting up the monitors and configuring the server connections, I booted up my data platform. The blue light from the screens was all the confirmation I needed. Porch. I set a disciplined, rigorous schedule, surviving on strong espresso, local bread, and the absolute determination never to let my family's predictions come true. My mother had claimed I would come crawling back the moment things got difficult, and my father had insisted I would be broke within a week. Porch. Whenever my hands cramped from typing or the quiet isolation of the apartment began to press in, I remembered the laughter between Marcus and Camille in my father's study. I converted that betrayal into pure focused momentum. I spent long nights writing code, refining my supply chain algorithms, building pitch decks, and sending cold emails to European distributors. Porch. My journey to establish myself on my own terms had officially begun, and I was fully prepared to put in the work required to build an enterprise that would stand entirely on its own merit. Those first 2 years in Barcelona were an intense blur of focused isolation and continuous effort. Calvin appeared furious that Julian had not shown more deference toward Spencer. Porch. My father leaned across the table, his voice sharp with irritation, telling Julian he ought to show proper gratitude to someone clearly operating at a higher level. Calvin insisted Spencer was offering valuable industry perspective and accused Julian of being too stubborn and proud to take sound advice from established figures. Porch. He claimed that very attitude was why Julian would never achieve real success or gain respect in elite circles, before turning his anger on me, saying, I should be embarrassed by my husband's lack of ambition and inability to network properly. My father then hurried off to catch up with Spencer, leaving us sitting alone in the dim perimeter of the back tables. Porch. I watched him walk away, feeling a deep sense of exhaustion at his desperate need for external validation. He was so committed to chasing elite approval that he would gladly allow an arrogant individual to insult his own family just to feel close to perceived influence. I turned to Julian and asked how he managed to stay so calm and composed when someone was openly disrespecting him to his face. Porch. Julian set his bourbon down on the white linen tablecloth, reached across and took my hand, his fingers lightly tracing my wedding band. He told me that a lion does not answer to a barking dog. He calmly explained that men like Spencer were simply insecure individuals, playing executive roles in expensive suits bought on credit. Porch. True influence, he said, never needs to announce itself at a country club engagement party to gain validation. Real leverage operates in complete silence and establishes its position before the other party even realizes the landscape has shifted. Porch. Julian added that he actually felt a brief moment of pity for Spencer, because the man was dancing across a legal and financial minefield without realizing the consequences of his actions had already been set in motion by the very people he was attempting to belittle. Porch. Grandmother Beatrice let out a low whistle of approval and took a sip of her iced tea. Looking at Julian with steady, genuine respect, she remarked that across her 80 years, she had watched plenty of loud men run themselves into ruin, but she had rarely seen someone handle a fool with such absolute patience and control. Porch. She patted Julian's arm, telling him he was exactly the kind of strong, composed partner her granddaughter deserved, adding that watching the reality set in for Spencer and my parents was going to be the most satisfying resolution she had witnessed in decades. I leaned back my chair, taking one final look across the crowded ballroom. Porch. As a forensic accountant, my entire career involves methodically building a case until the evidence becomes irrefutable. Tonight was no different. Emily had shown her hand in the restroom, revealing her financial insolvency and fabricated luxury lifestyle. Spencer had just shown his hand at our table, exposing his professional delusions and complete lack of operational insight. Porch. My parents had shown theirs by siding with individuals who were exploiting them while dismissing the only people offering genuine support. The entire ballroom was an elaborate display of financial and personal pretense, and I was the one holding every piece of verifiable documentation. Porch. Catering staff moved swiftly across the room, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with overpriced dishes my parents could ill afford. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the evening's main program. The DJ stepped up to the microphone, asking everyone to take their seats as the father of the bride, and the groom to be prepared to deliver their formal toasts. Porch. I watched Spencer stride confidently toward the small stage by the head table, holding a microphone in one hand and a fresh glass in the other, carrying himself like a man who believed he held every advantage. Porch. I looked down at the dark screen of the tablet resting securely in my evening clutch, containing the precise financial filings and forensic records that would dismantle his professional standing and deliver real legal accountability. My pulse settled into a steady, rhythmic beat. Porch. The condescension and corporate arrogance we had just endured were simply the final confirmations needed to close the file. I drew in a steady breath and prepared for what was coming, knowing that 31 years of staying silent was about to come to an end with absolute, undeniable clarity. Porch. The heavy velvet curtains by the main entrance were drawn shut, and the crystal chandeliers overhead softened to a warm glow, marking the formal dinner service. A line of servers in crisp white shirts entered the dining room, setting down dry, overcooked steaks and limp vegetables before the guests. Porch. Having spent my career analyzing corporate expenditures, it was immediately obvious that the venue had cut significant corners on the catering package my parents had chosen, using gold-trimmed china to maintain an illusion of luxury over mediocre food. Porch. I looked down at my plate with a quiet sense of vicarious embarrassment, knowing my parents had leveraged their own property just to serve substandard fare to a room full of people who held no genuine regard for them. The DJ lowered the background music as a brief screech of feedback hummed through the speakers. Porch. Spencer stood beside the head table, tapping his butter knife against a crystal champagne flute, demanding the full attention of the room. As he stepped up onto the small riser and grabbed the microphone with a heavy, sweating hand, he stumbled slightly. His face was flushed red and blotchy from drinking heavily at the open bar. Porch. He looked down at the sea of rented tuxedos and polite smiles with sheer, towering confidence, a man entirely convinced of his own fabrications. Spencer cleared his throat loudly into the mic to start his speech. He did not open by thanking my parents for hosting such an expensive dinner. He did not open by talking about how much he loved Emily. Porch. The moment he began speaking, it was entirely about himself. He bragged about his incredible work ethic and his supposedly massive, undeniable success in the financial world. His words slurred slightly as he boasted to the quiet room about his senior position at Vanguard Capital. Porch. He claimed he was single-handedly driving the firm's national market strategy, proudly announcing that his unmatched talent and aggressive portfolio management had earned him an official promotion to National Investment Director by the end of the fiscal quarter. Sitting in the dim light at the back corner table, I listened to his hollow claims echo off the walls. Porch. My analytical mind instantly dissected every fraudulent word. I had the verified facts. His accounts were severely overdrawn, his credit cards were completely maxed out, and above all, there was no promotion to National Investment Director. He was desperately manufacturing a false reality to keep his parents and mine from discovering that he was completely insolvent. Porch. He stood on that stage, making sweeping gestures, promising to buy Emily a sprawling mansion in the state's most exclusive zip code. He painted himself as the ultimate provider, stepping down from his corporate pedestal to elevate our family into high society. When Spencer clumsily raised his glass to toast his own fabricated greatness, the crowd offered polite applause. Porch. His parents sat at the front table glowing with artificial pride, hiding their own financial ruin behind tight, practiced smiles. Beside them, my mother Brenda acted as if she had just won the ultimate lottery, clapping so hard her hands had to hurt, looking around to make sure everyone saw how important her new son-in-law was. Porch. Emily, however, stared down at her lap, her fingers nervously twisting her white linen napkin. She knew the truth about her designer dress and their fabricated lifestyle. Because only an hour earlier, I had laid out the cold facts in the restroom. I began to make my way slowly and deliberately through the crowded tables, walking straight toward the central stage, where the speakers stood. Porch. Leaving the dim corner table, I navigated the maze of white linens and towering floral centerpieces. The heavy bass from the speakers vibrated through the polished floorboards, but my steps felt completely weightless. As I walked past, I watched the faces of distant relatives and my parents' social acquaintances. Porch. They looked puzzled and slightly annoyed, whispering behind crystal champagne flutes, wondering why the quiet, supposedly disappointing eldest daughter was walking toward the front of the room during her father's big moment. Calvin caught sight of me in his peripheral vision, and his smug, triumphant look wavered instantly. George. He gripped the microphone until his knuckles turned white, likely assuming I was coming up to cause a scene or demand a public apology for his condescending remarks earlier. He had no idea that I was not there to ask for anything. I was there to carry out a controlled, absolute dismantling of his entire facade. George. I bypassed the small stage where my father and Spencer were standing, walking straight to the audiovisual booth, tucked in the shadowed front corner of the ballroom. A young venue technician stood there half asleep in a cheap black vest, watching the laptop that was projecting a massive slideshow of Emily and Spencer onto the large screen behind the main table. George. It was looping heavily edited photos. Posing on chartered yachts, drinking champagne in high-end restaurants, and showing off the oversized diamond ring that was currently financed on predatory terms. Without saying a word to the technician, I reached out and pulled the main video feed directly from the side of his laptop. The massive display behind my father went completely black. George. The sudden drop into darkness sent a wave of confusion through the ballroom. People stopped cutting into their dry steaks and set their forks down. The murmuring across the room grew noticeably louder. George. Calvin tapped the microphone frantically, the dull thumps echoing through the speakers, angrily demanding that the AV crew fix the projection immediately because the presentation was not over and he still had important things to say about his remarkable future son-in-law. George. If you had stood in the center of my cramped apartment in El Raval and slowly turned in a circle, you would have seen the exact same scene playing out day after day, month after month. You would have seen me hunched over glowing monitors, the harsh blue light catching the dark circles under my eyes. George. You would have seen empty espresso cups piling up, winter rain streaking the narrow window panes before giving way to blazing summer heat, and then fading back into another long winter. Time stopped moving in a straight line. It was measured entirely in lines of code, algorithmic breakthroughs, and the steadily dropping balance of my offshore accounts. George. I was building a supply chain architecture for the global luxury market from the ground up. I mapped predictive models capable of tracking a single silk thread from a supplier in Milan all the way to a boutique shelf in Tokyo, identifying logistics bottlenecks before they even formed. I poured every ounce of heartache, anger, and fierce independence straight into the software's codebase. George. I never went out for tapas. I never took walks along the beach. I spoke to almost no one, except the man at the corner grocery store. That small apartment became a pressure cooker for raw ambition. I pushed my physical limits, dropping weight and getting by on dangerously little sleep. Then, the platform finally came to life. The code was clean. George. It was faster, smarter, and far more scalable than anything currently running in the European luxury market. Once the beta build stabilized and was ready for deployment, I had to make the transition from a hidden developer back into an executive demanding a seat at the table. George. I found a tailored charcoal suit at a local vintage shop, printed my pitch decks on heavy stock, stepped out of that cramped studio, and began knocking on the heavy doors of Europe's top venture capital firms. That was when the real battle began. I quickly realized that the suffocating biases I thought I had left behind in Atlanta had simply crossed the ocean with me. George. The European venture landscape was still tightly guarded by established networks of older men. They did not look at me like a tech innovator. They treated me like a statistical anomaly they had no intention of dealing with. I walked into glass boardrooms across Madrid, Paris, and Berlin, carrying an enterprise solution that could optimize their retail portfolios. George. Yet before I even opened my laptop to run the demo, I could see they had already made up their minds. I was a young Black American woman pitching a deeply complex, aggressive algorithmic infrastructure. I did not fit their traditional image of a tech founder. Rejections were routine, always wrapped in condescending corporate code. George. They would sit across wide mahogany conference tables with folded hands, asking if this was a passion project or a boutique lifestyle brand. They looked at a scalable supply chain framework and asked if I had considered pivoting into fashion blogging or consulting. One prominent French investor chuckled, tapped my proposal, and remarked that global logistics was an aggressive arena, heavily implying that my perspective was better suited for digital marketing. A group in Germany subjected me to a grueling 3-hour technical grilling, trying to find flaws in my architecture, only to pass with a vague note about cultural alignment. They never criticized the technology, because the technology was solid. What they took issue with was my presence in the room. Every pass felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me. My runway was vanishing. The modest funds I had brought from the States were draining away at a terrifying pace. I lived on cheap rice and beans, rationed my electricity, and slipped cardboard into the worn soles of my dress shoes. 18 months into my time abroad, on a freezing night in November, the weight almost broke me completely. I had just received my 42nd formal rejection. The investor claimed my valuation was overly optimistic for a solo founder without institutional backing. I sat on the cold floor, staring at the peeling yellow paint on the walls. In that fleeting moment of exhaustion, my father's voice echoed in my head, reminding me of his prediction that independent ventures fold in their first year. I remembered my mother sneering that I would come crawling back the moment things got tough. The temptation to walk away was heavy. Then the memory of that dismissive arrogance back home brought a wave of absolute resolve. I refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me fail. I refused to let a room full of biased investors determine the value of what I had built. I pulled myself up from the floor, walked to the small bathroom sink, and splashed cold water over my face. Looking into the cracked mirror, I saw someone exhausted, hungry, and completely broke. Yet I was far from finished. I sat back down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began researching an entirely different tier of capital. I stopped targeting traditional firms that only backed familiar profiles. I started looking for the disruptors, the private equity outliers operating in the competitive corners of the European market, people who prioritized cold, hard performance over comfortable conventions. Leora spoke with the quiet shock of someone struggling to process the reality of her own life. I sat beside her, giving her space to let the truth settle in fully before making a move. You do not have to make a choice out of panic, I said. But you do have to make a choice. Leora's jaw tightened. She wiped the last of the moisture from her cheeks, moving slowly. When she looked up, her gaze held a steady resolve that had never been there before. I need to go back out there, she said evenly. I need to make things clear. When we stepped back into the living room, the atmosphere felt fundamentally altered, even though every piece of furniture was in the exact same place. Delphine stood by the dining table, her purse clamped under her arm, the documents resting before her like a claim she refused to abandon. Harold hovered nearby with clenched teeth. Evan had turned halfway toward the door, ready to slip out and act as though he had never been involved. Julian stood caught between his family and Leora, looking less like a partner and more like someone stranded between two worlds, unsure where he stood. Leora walked straight past me with square shoulders. Her eyes were sharp and fixed. She did not look at the paperwork. She looked directly at her husband. Julian, she called out, her voice level, with no anger and no pleading, simply bringing him into the reality he had tried to avoid. Julian swallowed hard. Leah, he started, his voice trailing off, unable to find an excuse for what he had just allowed to happen. Delphine jumped in immediately, slipping back into her practiced composure. Sweetheart, she said, we do not need to do this here. You are upset. We will revisit it later. Leora raised an open hand, a simple, firm motion that cut Delphine off instantly. The silence that followed was total. Delphine stared at her with the deep offense felt by those who expect obedience when met with an unyielding boundary. Leora held her ground. No, she stated. You came to my grandmother's home. You brought a notary to her table. We are addressing it right now. Harold lowered his voice with a stern edge. Now listen here. Leora turned her gaze on him, completely calm. I have been listening, she said. Orch. That is the whole point. I heard everything. Evan let out a dry laugh to break the tension. This is completely blown out of proportion. Leora did not even glance his way. You were ready to stand by and watch me sign legal papers. I had never even read, she replied steadily. So do not talk to me about blowing things out of proportion. Julian's neck flushed with visible shame. Orch. He took a hesitant step forward, trying to salvage the moment. Babe, my mom thought. She did not think, Leora cut in, her voice sharp and decisive. It was deliberate. Delphine forced another cold smile. Are you accusing me of acting in bad faith? She asked. Her words smooth but laced with venom. Leora nodded once. Yes, she said. Orch. Because genuine protection does not show up unannounced with a notary. The words shut down Delphine's argument entirely. Harold pressed his lips together. Evan looked around for an exit that did not look like a retreat, and Julian's shoulders sank under the heavy cost of his silence. Delphine leaned in, dropping her polished tone for something much sharper. Orch. Your name is Carter now, she said, treating the name like an obligation. You do not treat this family like strangers. Leora's expression never wavered. I am not treating you like strangers, she answered. I am treating you exactly as you presented yourselves today. Delphine's eyes flashed with anger. So what is your plan? To humiliate your husband the morning after your wedding? Orch. Leora lifted her chin. You humiliated him the moment you conditioned him to stand aside and say nothing. Julian flinched as if struck. Watching my granddaughter in that room, a deep sense of relief settled over me. It was not about winning an argument. It was about watching her choose her own ground. Leora reached into her pocket and took out her phone. Delphine froze instantly. Orch. Put that away, she snapped. This is a private matter. Leora did not hit record, and she did not call the authorities. She opened her messaging app, typed a single line with steady hands, and turned the screen toward Delphine so there was no mistaking her intent. I have already messaged Marianne Ellis, Leora said evenly. The trustees will receive formal notice regarding this attempt today. Orch. Harold went pale. Evan muttered a curse under his breath, and Julian stared at the screen as if looking at an absolute verdict. Delphine's composure broke completely, replaced by the chill of a calculated move falling apart. You would not do that, she whispered. You would compromise your own husband. Leora kept her eyes locked on her. Orch. You already did that when you walked through that door, she replied. She stepped up to the table, picked up the stack of papers, and slid them firmly back across the wood to Delphine. Take your formalities and leave, Leora said. Do not show up uninvited again. Delphine took a shaky breath, gathered the documents with a rough sweep into her bag, and turned to Julian. Let us go, she ordered. Orch. Julian hesitated. For the first time, he did not immediately follow. He looked toward Leora, his eyes pleading. Leora did not soften, and she did not harden. She simply stood her ground, waiting for his decision. Julian swallowed hard and took a step back, moving away from his mother and toward the entryway. I need time, he murmured quietly. Delphine whipped around toward him. Time? She hissed. Orch. After everything we have done for you? Julian stood rigid. I saw what you tried to do, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold's eyes widened, Evan looked away, and Delphine's face twisted with frustration that she could no longer control under my roof. She turned and marched out the front door, Harold and Evan following right behind without another word. Orch. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving behind a silence that felt completely different, the steady calm that follows a resolved conflict. Leora let out a long, slow breath she had been holding since the morning began. Julian stood near the entryway with trembling hands, staring at the floor, finally taking in the reality of the situation he had allowed to unfold. Orch. I did not gloat, and I did not preach. I walked over to my cabinet, opened it, and returned the old envelope to the bottom drawer. the records, the notes, and the warnings I had kept for years. Turning the key, I locked the drawer and shut the cabinet door. Leora watched me, and in her eyes I saw absolute understanding. Holding her silence had not just preserved the estate. It had preserved her independence. I crossed the room, took her hand, and gave it a firm, reassuring squeeze, a quiet understanding between two women who had learned the exact same lesson in different chapters of life. Generational legacy does not endure because you hand it over to keep the peace. It endures because you keep it secure until you know without a doubt who deserves to stand beside it. I walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and let the lock slide into place with a definitive, solid click.